afternoon and welcome. Um, we have two amazing speakers this afternoon, and it's going to be talking about top 5 lawsuits affecting your restaurant, as well as our next speaker, which is going to be our first speaker, Bill Mason, who is the Vice President of Warden Brown, a general agency for healthcare reform. This is everything you're going to need to know about health insurance and how your restaurant or any business you have is going to be affecting you. Bill has been in the business for 18 years with Warden Brown under the healthcare and everything you need to know. I will give the mic to Bill and he will talk about that, and then afterwards we're going to have Scott Cooper, who is the insurance broker for the top 50 agency in Southern California, speaking to you about the restaurant, liability, workers' comp, but mostly the 5 top lawsuits all the restaurant owners need to know about, and we will educate you on how to protect yourself. So thank you again for coming. Bill?
Thank you. Well, thanks to everybody for coming. Just wanted to, I work for Warden Brown. We're a general agent for health insurance. General agent means that we don't, we work with all the different companies across the board, and we shop for solutions for individual business needs. And so with that being said, we've done a lot of work with restaurant groups this last year. Restaurant groups have run the gamut from chains, groups of Subway restaurants, groups of individual restaurants, large chains restaurants, a lot of opportunities, because at this point in time, most of you are going to have to address, based on the size of your restaurant, whether, or the number of employees that you have, whether or not you are required to offer health insurance. The second part of that is everybody is required to have health insurance. Every individual American is required to have health insurance. So you're also going to get feedback from your employees as they did their taxes this year. Why didn't they get as big a tax return as they got last year? Because they didn't have health insurance, and so they had some issues with getting all of their return back. So let me find the presentation. This is actually the second time that we've had healthcare reform in California. There was a crisis in the early 90s where a lot of small businesses were not able to get health insurance. And so in California, we actually had healthcare reform already one other time. And that was when they passed AB 1672, which was a healthcare reform law which guaranteed small businesses health insurance. Prior to that law being passed, a lot of businesses that would fall in the 2 to 50 marketplace were not able to get health insurance, or they were being declined or given prices that they couldn't afford. So in 1993, they passed AB 1672 and created the small group guaranteed issue market, which if you had a small business with 2 to 50 lives, they had to take you regardless of your health conditions. So it created a new marketplace. Well, under the new ACA law, we have guaranteed issue. But for the past 4 years, they've maintained that 2 to 50 window. But next year, starting in January, that window is going to expand from 2 to 50 to 1 to 100. Will be considered a small group. So there's a lot of you that are business owners that have multiple restaurants. And it's really important to know how to count the total number of employees, because it really counts towards what your definition of a restaurant, or the number of full-time eligible employees that you have. So this slide talks about myth busting. There's been a lot of confusion around what the contribution should be, what your contribution should be, what the percentages of healthcare coverage would be. So as a business owner, if you're providing health insurance, the key component is that you're required to pay at least 50% of the employee's cost, just the employee's cost. Where there was some confusion is the 60% rule. Well, that 60% is an actuarial value that they talk about the level of insurance that they've created, or the method as they go forward in paying out claims. So you have that 60% methodology, and it gets confused with the contribution versus what is actually. So there's a lot of confusion here. What's considered a large employer, and what is the 60%? The 60% talks about benefits. It's not your contribution. Minimum contribution is the cost that you would apply towards the plan. This law has been in effect for 4 years. And over time, it's been, we get updates almost daily as to what's going on with this particular law. And a lot of things are changing. So as time rolls on, we've had a lot of things that we've had to adjust to. Supreme Court upheld this last year in 2012. There's been a lot of questions. I'm going through this very, very quickly, guys, simply because there's a lot of slides, but there's parts of this that I want to talk specifically about your restaurant groups. So grandfathered plans. If you've had a plan in place for the last 4 years, or we don't even talk about grandfathered plans much anymore. There's only one carrier out there that still has a grandfathered plan. What a grandfathered plan means, you remember Obama stood at the podium and says, if you have health insurance today, you're going to be able to have your health insurance tomorrow. We're not going to make any changes. But the grandfathering law rules have altered throughout the time. And so what it basically means, if you didn't make any changes to the plan that you had 4 years ago, you have a grandfathered plan. But as you're aware, every year you need to evaluate your business needs. Every year you're going to look what carrier is out there, what carrier is competitive. And carriers go in cycles. It's about a 3-year cycle. So it's very, very rare to have somebody that hasn't made any plan changes, any benefit changes, any changes to their plan in the last 4 years. In California, one of the changes that just got signed into law was, in California, we have waiting period rules. Now, in the old way, when you had a grandfather plan, your waiting period, you could have a 30-day waiting period, you can have a year's waiting period. There was all different, you were completely flexible in what you could do. When California adopted, and this is what California had to do, is they had to adopt the ACA law, or the Affordable Care Act law. So we passed our own version of that law in California. But California, being California, does things a little bit differently. And so they made a couple of things a little bit stronger than the federal law. So basically what they did was, since these people are not people that know how health insurance works per se, they adopted what they thought would be the most important part. And one of these things has to do with the waiting period. The federal ACA law says that the waiting period can be no longer than 90 days. Well, those of us in the insurance business think of 90-day wait is the first of the month following a 90-day. Under the federal law, it has to be first of the month, or they have to have their health insurance by their 90th day of continuous employment. So in California, we said, let's do that differently. Let's make it 60 days. We're going to make them get insurance faster. So it was 60 days. So last year, they amended the California law to follow the federal version. And did you all know that we're a tobacco-friendly state? California, you cannot rate, your health insurance cannot be rated for tobacco use. It's one of the laws that we've had on the books for quite some time. I always find that factoid funny. So we've talked about the waiting period. These were some of the grandfather plans. They must cover the minimum essential benefit coverages. These were the minimum essential. These are the things that had to be added to the plans that were being sold after 2014. Now what this means is anytime you have a mandate or a requirement, a federal law that changes, anytime that happens, what do you think happens to premiums? Anytime you require a plan to cover more, your rates are going to go up. And so that's exactly why we get the question all the time, why are the rates going so much higher than they were before? Well, this is one of the reasons, is because the federal government is requiring these minimum coverages. The other thing that they did when you talk about rating methodology, one of the things that's really interesting about this particular law is it used to be that we were rated on large geographical areas. So you would get a rate for Riverside County, for Orange County, for LA County. Well, now, they didn't make it more confusing enough. They introduced 19 rating regions, okay? And so you also have a 3-age band limit. What that means is your people that are less than 20 years old and the people that are over 65, those are 2 age bands, and your people that are 65 years old cannot pay any more than 3 times what the 0 to 20s pay. So in the middle of that, you've got a new rate every year for each individual. That's 21, 22, 23, all the way up. So those are how they get around the 3 age bands. So when I get a question like, what is an average rate for a group? I can't answer that question. The average rate for a group is specific to that group. Right now, we're going through a time where we're quoting a bunch of different carriers, a bunch of different plans, because everybody has to get compliant by January 1st, 2016. And so we're quoting everything, and it's made the methodology very confusing, but it's very specific to each and every group. We need dependent states of birth because we need to quote them correctly. So it's very specific, and that's why we're so busy right now just preparing quotes and providing people with information so that you can make informed decisions. This is one thing that I wanted to spend some time with you. So knowing how to count is very, very important, especially in your industry. In the restaurant business, one of the rules that we have is common ownership rules. So if you own multiple restaurants or you're a franchisee owner, you need to count all the employees that you're responsible for, all the different business entities that you have. You need to count all those employees as part of your total. Now, I'm sure some of you are familiar with a company called Darden Industries. Darden Industries is Olive Garden, and they have a whole bunch of other big restaurants. Well, they did something pretty silly. After this bill was passed, they talked to a reporter and said, we're just going to manage our employees down to less than 30 hours a week. That's great, because you don't have to offer coverage for your part-time employees. But that doesn't mean your part-timers go away. Your part-timers become really, really important because you have to count all their hours. Now, the only reason why you're counting your part-timers and counting their hours is to determine whether or not you're required to offer health insurance. So right now, currently, if you have more than 100 employees, including these full-time eligibles, how you do that is you add up all your part-timers, you divide all that number by 120 hours, and that gives you full-time equivalents. So if you add those full-time equivalents to what you consider your regular full-time eligible employees, and that number is over 100, you are required to offer health insurance, or you'll pay a penalty. In January, that's going to change. If you have more than 50 employees, then you are required to offer the health insurance. So that's really it's really important for your industry to understand how you count and why you count. Now, the only reason why you count is to determine whether or not you're required to offer insurance. But then once you've determined, it's only your full-time eligibles that you have to worry about getting them insurance. Now, these full-time eligible employees, there are lots of programs out there specific to restaurants. And we're coming up on a time period right now which is really, really important, because in every year, one of the things that the ACA law did was every year between November 15th and December 15th, you can put a plan in place with no participation requirements and no contribution requirements. And this is important for your business because the federal government says if I have more than 50 employees, I'm required to offer a plan. It doesn't mean that my employees are going to take the plan. Okay, a lot of your employees are going to be lower on the lower income levels, and they don't want to spend their money on health insurance. So your participation rates with restaurants has traditionally been very, very low. So we need to look for these programs that specialize in offering health insurance to restaurants. Anthem Blue Cross has a great program right now that you can have anytime. If you're a Virgin Group, if you've never offered health insurance, they have a program that we can show you that shows you how to, there's no participation requirements on it. But during November through December, all the carriers have to offer this special open enrollment period. And during the special open enrollment period, you don't have to contribute the minimum 50%. You don't have to meet participation requirements. The only reason why you would pay the 50% is if you wanted to write it off on your taxes. But if you didn't want to write it off on your taxes, you don't have to pay that 50%. You can have a reduced contribution. It's just to offer a plan to your employees so that you've met your compliance issue. You've done what you are required to do under the ACA law. So there's all kinds of different ways that we can show you how to offer insurance, how to get insurance for your employees. But that counting of your employees is very, very important. How am I doing? Doing okay? 5 minutes? So what is the definition of a common ownership group? You've got a lot of different definitions. I'm not going to go into all of them. The rule of thumb is if you own more than 50% of two different businesses, you probably have common ownership, and you probably need to count those employees together. We have seen as little as 4% ownership, and it's still considered common ownership, and this is the reason why. It's control of that group. If you are the managing partner and you are telling your employees when to go to work and when they can go home and when they have to be there, you're in control of that group. That's probably common ownership. And I'm not an attorney, I'm not an accountant. You want to get some specialized assistance when determining who are your groups that you need to insure. So under the ACA, if the employees work more than 30 hours a week, they're considered full-time. That has been the definition in California since 1993. There are some safe harbors in case you make mistakes. Defining the periods, what this means is if you have a large group of employees and you have employees that are going from part-time to full-time, and that's going to happen over time. A lot of restaurants are using these 3 periods to count back as long as you possibly can to eliminate as many of the full-time eligibles as you possibly can. Because as you know, your business, you hire and fire a lot of employees. They're constantly turning over. So if you have a 12-month look-back period, you have a 12-month look-forward period, it reduces the total number of employees that you have to offer insurance to. And again, we would be more than happy to sit down with you and discuss how this works. A lot of this presentation is just discussing how you keep track of those part-time to full-time. And what I want to leave you with is penalties. When you have a group that you have more than 50 employees and you do nothing, you don't offer health insurance to your employees, basically what ends up happening is one of your employees will go to Covered California because they'll be eligible for a subsidy. But there's 2 types of subsidies. There's a benefit subsidy and there's a premium assistance subsidy. There's 2 different types. One reduces the cost that they're out of pocket, and the other one helps them pay for the premium. The reduction in premium is pretty severe. So you will have somebody that goes to Covered California and gets their insurance. What that does, it'll trigger an audit back to your company is, how many employees do you have? And how many employees are full-time and eligible? They will count up all your full-time eligible employees and apply a $2,000 penalty to each uninsured employee, but they'll forgive the first 30. So if you have 40 employees, but you have 20 part-timers, that puts you over the 50 eligible. In January, you're supposed to offer health insurance, or it's going to trigger that penalty. So you would be paying a $20,000 penalty on the 10 people above 30 that you're not paying. We can show you ways to use that $20,000 and provide benefits to your employees, because this is a flat tax. You can't write it off. It's a tax above the line. So we'll help you, show you how you can use the money that you would be charged anyway if you don't do anything. If you provide insurance and it's unaffordable, that's a different penalty that can be applied. But we would love to have time to sit down and discuss all of that with you. But that's the basics of ACA. I just want to leave you with the fact that we have been doing a lot of restaurant groups. We've been finding solutions. There are ways to make sure that you get your needs covered. Thank you very much.
Welcome, everyone. Imagine this. This is a real story. These are things I deal with quite often. You go in a restaurant and you see this homeless guy. Everybody hear me okay? You see this homeless guy out in your parking lot for a couple weeks. He's always hanging around, and you decide that you're going to give him a job, and you're going to pay him for watching your parking lot so only customer cars could park at your parking lot. So he seems to be doing a good job for a couple months, and you're very pleased with him. So you decide to offer him a job in your kitchen, as a dishwasher. So you give this guy $3,000 cash, the owner does, and he helps him relocate his place to live and to buy some clothes. He puts him in his kitchen. Things seem to be going fine for about 6 months. Doesn't seem to be any problems. And then all of a sudden he looks in the mail, and the envelope he's got from an attorney, it's a lawsuit for hostile work environment, sexual harassment, claiming that another employee pulled his pants down. And from your restaurant, you just have a normal horseplay that goes in the kitchen, and you weren't aware of anything else that goes on. And the insurance company decides they're going to take this case all the way to court for a jury verdict. About 2 years go by, and the judge reads the verdict. It's dismissed. You're elated. You won this case. The insurance company spent $250,000 to win. Even if you win, you lose. I think everybody knows the saying, no good deed goes unpunished. So imagine if you didn't have the proper insurance to cover you, where's that $250,000 going to come from? We're going to be talking about various items involving your liability. liability, workers' comp, and various items of employer practice liability insurance, sexual harassment, wage and hour. Here's someone working really hard to grow their business, and you never want to be thrown off guard by the unexpected. So all these various subjects we'll be talking about, and to make sure that you have the right type of coverage and protection and not be caught short and have a major lawsuit against you where you're not covered. These are the top 5 lawsuits that you're facing. For liability, the key is there, what's your potential loss? Everybody has a lease that used to be like $1 million coverage, but those are 30 years ago. Where today, it may be a lot more in case of a lawsuit. What's your potential? You usually want to have assets of what you have liability coverage of. Next, you want to make sure that you want to talk about your valet and garage keepers coverage. This is a very common occurrence within a restaurant. You have an independent valet guy, and when you got to make sure you're additional insured on his policy. And I had a restaurant that thought his valet guy that parked his cars for him was covered. His valet guy hit somebody, killed somebody, sued the restaurant, and the valet guy find out has no insurance covering him, and his restaurant is lost. Next is non-owned auto. This is when you have like an employee that's going to go to the bank or Smart and Final for you, and he hits somebody away from the restaurant during working hours, and it's your fault. This is part of your policy. It may only be a couple $100, but it's very valuable. It's very valuable coverage. If you do delivery or catering, now you may want a non-owned auto policy just to cover your delivery. You know, the guy's vehicle may only have 1530 coverage, but a non-owned auto policy would cover you from 1530 that he's required to have up to $1 million that your policy covers. And these are for vehicles you don't own. Of course, if it's your vehicle, you have your insurance. This is if somebody's delivering for vehicles that he doesn't own. Entities. You may have a policy that has your restaurant name on it. What we find is that policies are entity specific, meaning that if you don't have all your management companies, or maybe you have a holding company, that you don't name all the right entities and you get sued, you know, your policy is going to be null and void. You'll have no coverage. We had a restaurant just before the weekend insured, and the owner wasn't sure what name he should have on his policy. But we, you know, on our own accord, we added that name. No additional charge. On a Sunday, he had a major fire, and if we didn't have that right entity that we put on the policy, that would be a difference of $0 to $2 million. We're going to get into the areas that involve employment law, that are discrimination, and what are American part of discrimination is American with Disability Act. This is when someone's coming in your restaurant that's with a wheelchair, all kinds of lawsuits, that's looking to make sure that you're American Disability Act compliance. A lot of restaurants think they're grandfathered just because, well, they've been here for 50 years, they don't have to worry about it. This is a federal law. We have all kinds of lawsuits where a mirror's been too high, or a sink has been too low, or the aisle between it, or parking. I know I have a number of clients that have been sued because their parking lot didn't have the right measurements. These type of items I'll be talking about can be covered in employer practice liability policy, and these are potential losses that you can have. Service animals. At a restaurant where a gentleman comes in with a Great Dane, and the owner asked him, would you please go out in the patio, because I don't, you know, not in the dining room. And the individual refused, and he sued because it was not only was it a service animal, but he has a right to sit anywhere in the restaurant. And they don't even have to have a little, like everybody knows those little signs that are on the dogs, service animal. As long as they tell you it's a service animal, that's enough for the law. So we've had a lot of cases where we even had at the beach. A gentleman came in this restaurant with a Rottweiler, wanted to come in the restaurant, a homeless guy. And the restaurant manager said, no, I'm not letting you in the restaurant with that dog. You can sit in the patio. And he gets sued because it's a service animal and it's discrimination. So these are some of the items that you could be vulnerable for, that you need to be covered for. Protected classes. I'll tell you what's a not protected class. Is if you're a male, white, single, no religious affiliation, straight, and under 40. That's what's not protected. Almost everybody else could sue you for various items. So it just tells you today how many various areas you could be vulnerable from a lawsuit for almost any type of thing or action. Next, we're going to talk about wage and hour. You want to know, make sure that your employee is classified whether he's exempt or non-exempt. Talk a little about meal and rest periods and class action lawsuits. And then, of course, the newest law that came July 1, the mandatory sick leave. You want to make sure that your employee, is he hourly or is he, again, exempt or non-exempt, know what his classification is. Otherwise, you could be vulnerable for various types of actions of overtime, not giving a proper time off. You could be vulnerable for that. Everybody knows from the Brinker case, which is for meal and rest periods, that now they're optional. They used to be mandatory. But now you have to make sure that you give them the time to be able to take their meal break. We had many lawsuits before. We're still getting some now because they can still go back 3 years and sue you for an hourly employee not getting a proper meal break. Whenever there's a lawsuit at a restaurant, sometimes if it involves more than one employee, then it could be a class action lawsuit. We've had a number of these over the years where it's a number of employees that will join a lawsuit, become a class action lawsuit. You want to make sure you have the right coverage to protect you on this. We've had lawsuits involving tip pooling because a manager took part of the tips and that they weren't a direct server to the table, they weren't entitled to it. There's a lawsuit. So you want to make sure you know all the rules and regulations involving what you potentially could be sued for. And July 1st is the mandatory sick pay. For every 30 hours worked, they get 1 hour of sick pay. Make sure it's recorded, and make sure it's capped at 3 days a year. And if you're not following the law directly on this, you could be vulnerable to lawsuit as well. So at the end of this little conference, if we make sure we have your email, we're having a great handout from one of the top labor attorneys talking about all the various steps that you need to do to make sure you're doing the right thing for the July 1st mandatory sick pay. Wrongful termination. We're going to talk about at-will employment, about the employee handbook, and documentation. For at-will employment, even though it's in your job application, it says you're at will, there's no teeth to it. Everybody thinks it's legal protection. But in California, yes, you have to have at-will employment. But it doesn't mean that someone still cannot sue you. It doesn't really give you that legal protection. So that's a fallacy a lot, that you don't have to worry about employer practice because you're already covered, where that's not true. Employee handbook. Whenever you're in a labor lawsuit, besides the documentation, the first thing the opposing attorney want to look at is your employee handbook. Is it all the rules and regulation of your restaurant? Sometimes a restaurant owner may just have a handbook maybe given to him from something before, but it's got to be specifically for your restaurant with all the things that you do. And I really highly recommend that you hire a cognizant labor attorney going over these items with you. Make sure your employees sign for it, and that it is a complete handbook. And something that's most important is the arbitration agreement within the handbook. So good handbook, that'll help minimize some of your potential loss when you do have one. And the most important, when there's claims, we're always hearing from various labor attorneys, oh, I fired this guy, or I gave him Family Medical Leave Act, or I reprimanded him, and there's no documentation. Make sure for all the various areas that you document and put it in your file for any action that takes place. The better you document it, the better it is. If it does become a lawsuit, the better you can defend it. Sexual harassment is such a broad area. Verbal, nonverbal, fraternization, third party. Verbal, nonverbal. Everybody knows about sexting today. That even if someone in one of your employees, between employees, they're goofing around on their cell phone, even if somebody makes a symbol, almost anything can be construed as sexual harassment. Even in your locker room, someone leaves a dirty magazine. That's part of sexual harassment. Even though 2 hours of training is required for when you have over 50 employees in California, it's highly recommended that you get a sharp labor attorney that can come provide sexual harassment training to all your employees. Sometimes I hear, well, I don't want my employees to know about that maybe I have employer practice liability. Well, most of the time your employees know what's going on. So training them what is sexual harassment, not sexual harassment. Sometimes it's just, they'll horseplay, they'll goof around in a restaurant, and someone could say, hey, you bumped into me, or you touched me. So for them to know what could be considered sexual harassment could avoid a lot of costly litigation. Fraternization. There's something today called a love contract. If you know you have a boyfriend or girlfriend within your restaurant, actually there's a contract that they could sign that you won't be held liable. As a relationship goes sour, they could say they could sue you for a hostile work environment, or you permitted this relationship. So there's actually things in that area that can help minimize your lawsuit. And it doesn't matter if it's even consensual or not. Third party. Some third party could be a vendor, could be a customer, and this sometimes could be covered in employer practice liability policy, and sometimes not. It just depends on the option is in there, but you could be vulnerable for it. Everybody knows about a Denny's where the black Secret Service agents were discriminated against. Well, that is a third party claim. They're actually found guilty, and it was a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against them. So you want to make sure that this type of coverage you have in your policy, because you could be vulnerable to a lawsuit on that. Next, we're going to cover a subject called directors and officers. This is for restaurants that have investors. These are for the non-owners of the restaurant. These are not corporate officers, and these are not the owners. These are investors where they're going to make a claim against you for any type of mismanagement, not properly, I had a claim from a restaurant that had an investor, and they sued him just because, it wasn't successful. Well, they claimed mismanagement or misrepresentation. It was a $150,000 lawsuit. So if you have investors within your restaurant, they're not owners, the policy's not that expensive. I had a recent restaurant owner for 5 restaurants, was this example, $5,000, helped him sleep at night, not having to worry about an investor suing him for something that maybe he might have made a mistake on. So in summary, the key is you want to make sure that you have a policy that's very comprehensive of employer practice liability insurance, that most of these items can be covered. And then I hear objectives saying, well, my restaurant customers are like family. Well, they may be like family, but their attorneys are not. So the key is, of all the policies, that you have a professional insurance agent that knows the coverages really well, they're able to go to all the major markets, because some of these items are hundreds of items within a policy, to make sure you have the right coverages, you're comparing the right premiums, and there's a major difference between companies and coverages, and it's just so important to be able to know what they are. An objective of a lot of professional insurance brokers is to save you enough, like maybe liability or workers' comp, where you can add another type of policy, like employer practice liability, with minimum or no cost. Just by going to the marketplace, making sure that you're shopping the policy properly, and making sure you're doing a proper job in comparing coverages. Along with the seminar, the various services, you get a free risk analysis for an hour. I'm available for any time, whether I work with work with you or not, to be able to do a risk analysis of your business. And I had some new clients of mine that indicated to me that maybe they outgrew their old broker because coverages have changed so much. What was a couple years ago may be different this year. And we see just not having one little item may make the difference of a couple $100,000 or not. And you could just see by the slide of how many different areas that there are. And in the lower right has the average payout for some of the claims I've been talking about. $150,000, $200,000. These are just the average for some of these claims involving employer practice liability insurance. So it's all these different areas that can make your restaurant very vulnerable on that to various claims. So in summary, is again, check carefully your policy, have a professional, making sure you're doing, all the various areas. I always say, what you don't know, you don't know. You need to be pointed out, all these various coverage items. And at least you have as an option. The key is you never want to have a surprise. And I've had clients where they're sitting in a restaurant burned down, they're sitting on a trailer with their adjuster, and either they're underinsured, they don't have the right coverage, and then they find out too late that maybe they're out a couple of hundreds of thousands of dollars or even more. So you want to make sure you have all the right things. And if you have any questions afterwards, I'm happy to talk to you either right after the show or give us a call. And I said, whether work with you or not, we're happy to give you any type of proper advice on the coverage I talked about. So the education is probably the most important thing, and analyzing the risk. So thank you, and I do look forward to hearing from you. And please, right after the show, we have a book, and it's all these crazy claims I've had over 30 years and how to avoid them in maybe your own restaurant. So as you're thinking about your own restaurant, maybe some of those you could be related to on some of those little things. Our phone number's out there. Frida and I and Bill were available afterwards in any areas that we could be of help. And we look forward to talking with you and working with you. Thank you. Oh, by the way, does anybody have any questions? I know it's just about the end hour. Anybody have any questions that we can address, Bill or I?
About the 30 hours of work, we get 1 hour of sick leave.
Right.
Paid time off.
Right. So Eddie asked about for the 30 hours work, you get 1 hour of sick leave. If you give me your email right after the show, there's a great handout by a labor attorney that explains all the rules and regulations, the state law, and all the things that you need to do step by step to comply with the law.
Okay.
Like it's got to be in your paycheck every 2 weeks. You got to record it. All the various things. So I think that'll answer most of your questions.
Yeah.
And if you have any additional questions, we'll be able to answer that specifically.
Okay.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Should we leave you our business
Oh yeah, please,
card?
yes. For a copy of the PowerPoint for Bill and I, you have your PowerPoint there. Alfreda does. Please leave us your email address afterwards, and we can send you this PowerPoint and Bill's PowerPoint. Separate, you could reference later, take a look at on it, and thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Kind of glossed over some of the wage and hour, but I was curious if I wasn't aware of wage and hour being covered.
Oh yeah, there's a question about wage and hour being coverage employer practice liability policy. A lot less today, but yes, we do have a number of companies that will still cover wage and hour. What they'll cover, a standard EPLI policy will cover like $1 million for sexual harassment, wrongful termination, discrimination. But wage and hour, they'll provide from $100,000 to $150,000 legal defense. So it won't cover the actual lost wages because you didn't, maybe, for example, you didn't pay somebody overtime. It won't cover state or federal mandated to pay them, but it will cover the legal defense for you to, when you get sued. And this, thank you for bringing that up because we've had a lot of claims involving wage and hour. Even though meal breaks are now optional, we still get a lot. I have an employee being sued because unfortunately he paid an employee cash, and he's being sued for 9 different items. Well, he's not going to pay employees cash, but at least provide some legal defense. So that's an important part of an EPLI policy. So you want to make sure that's in there because virtually probably 99% of policies I sell will have it in there because that's 50% of my claims involving wage and hour. you didn't pay me. I even have an example of a restaurateur where an employee walked off the job, and the employee tried to reach him, tried to mail him his checks, and it was a bad address. So, it came back in the mail, he put it in his file, and he didn't think, he said, well, eventually the employee's going to come back. He was sued because he didn't mail him his paycheck within 72 hours, but he showed the judge, well, look, it was returned. He said, well, show me your phone log that you made 4 calls to try to reach him, and show me where you certified return receipt, where you mailed that check. $125,000 it cost the restaurateur just for not doing the proper things and mailing out checks. And I've seen clients that had half a dozen checks sitting in their files that didn't mail out to the employee. All that's under wage and hour, the defense on it, and I still get quite often claims in that. That's a really good question. Any other questions?
The half an hour, the break.
Oh, the break.
Yes, because the employee has to say, I don't want a break, or can we tell them, no, don't take a break, go straight.
Now, she's asking about the 30-minute break. Well, today, breaker case, it's not, you have to make it available for them, but it's not required. But afterwards, I have an excellent handout to talk to you about the meal break, what the, not only make it available for what the employee needs to sign, so you have to make sure specifically you're addressing that properly. Because I've had some lawsuits where even the employee is optional to take a meal break. They're saying, well, I was too busy, I didn't have the chance to be able to take it. So there's still a lot of lawsuits in that area.
So for the sign part, do they have to sign every single time, or is it just one time for whatever they want to, for the 30-minute meal break if they want to waive it?
Well, specifically for that, now we have a handout, but then I'm going to refer you to a labor attorney that I would recommend that you just ask that question to, because there's certain laws and regulations you have to comply with. Again, I'm a broker, not an attorney, but I want to make sure you have exact proper information. But I do have those handouts that he gives me to hand out. So they're all on his website, which I have information on, and you can see what the requirements are to have the employee sign to make sure that they have this, optional meal break that is made available to them. Are there any other questions? Any questions for Bill regarding health insurance, the new health care reform that you're required to do?
For that, when does it take effect when you said that it's 1-200 instead of 250?
January 1st.
Okay.
January 1st.
Any other questions? Thank you. Our book's available outside. Please give us your email. Please give us your email address, and we can send you the PowerPoint, any other additional information that you need. And thank you.
Thank you so much.